Hello, my name is Paul Slovic, and I'm excited to take you on a tour today of the psychology of risk, a topic I've been fortunate to study for some 60 years with a lot of fine colleagues, and I hope you'll find it as fascinating a topic as I do. So let's get right into it. The main message of this lecture is that understanding the psychology of risk and decision making is vitally important as we struggle to manage the enormous human and environmental risks of today and prepare for the challenges of the future. So some important questions that I'll address in my lecture are: how do people think about and make decisions about risk? What factors determine the perception of risk and the acceptance of risk? Why do we fight about some risk issues? What role do emotion, reason, personality, and cultural factors play in risk perception? Why do risk perceptions matter? What are the social, economic, political, health, and safety consequences of risk perceptions? And why do scientists, government officials, business leaders, and health experts also need to understand risk perception? So in addressing these questions, I'll draw on research and some of the lessons that research has taught us about risk. For example, risks of concern change over time and differ between groups and between societies, cultures, and nations. Risk analysis conducted by experts is complex and often controversial. Risk is subjective and value-laden, and the perception and communication of risk can be studied empirically in the laboratory and in the field. Finally, risk perceptions lead to behaviors that can result in enormous personal, social, political, and economic consequences. A few more lessons. Trust is vital for perception, communication, and acceptance of risk. Trust is hard to earn and easy to lose. Most risk perception is determined by fast, intuitive gut feelings rather than by careful deliberation. And finally, understanding risk perception is essential for effective risk communication. So the overview then of the lecture that will address these questions is I'll start with talking about the complexity of risk and the fact that there's a lot of conflict and controversy about risk issues. And then this also relates closely to the fact that we have multiple ways to define and measure risk. This is why it's kind of easy to debate and fight about it. Then I'll go into studies of perceived risk and the differences between experts and laypersons' perceptions, some economic and other impacts of perceptions, and this relates to something called the social amplification of risk, and the fact that there's something called stigma that is a major element in amplifying the importance and the impacts of risk. I'll talk about risk and trust, and throughout the lecture the underlying factor that's important is that listening to people and respecting their knowledge and values and concerns is of the utmost importance in dealing with risk. So first let's look at the complexity of risk, the fact that risk is a complex and controversial concept. And there's something, the overall arching field here is called risk analysis, and it has three components: risk assessment, risk management, and something called politics that I say intervenes between assessment and management. So the assessment of risk has to do with identifying hazards and quantifying them and characterizing them in various ways. And this feeds into risk management, which involves the decision making about risk and determining what risks are acceptable, how safe is safe enough, and communicating and evaluating risk. And in between this path between assessing risk and managing it is something that intervenes that I call politics, and that involves perception of risk, values, issues of process, who makes the decision, and some messy factors such as power and trust that lead often to conflict and controversy. So this is kind of the grand overview of this field. And here's another view of this. I'll give you several pictures of the complexity of risk. So we have science in the center of risk assessment. And science, of course, is very important. I'll be a little critical of risk science, but you have to recognize that we need risk science, and it is very sophisticated, although not perfect. And so we have issues of perception and culture and politics and power and so forth that I will get into. And basically we see that the complexity of risk involves the fact that it results from analysis, it results from feelings, it's very much influenced by culture, and there's politics that play a role as well. This is the complexity of risk. And risk is often at the center of conflict and controversy. This is a rather old picture, but still unfortunately timely. In 1982, the United States decided to search for a site to put the waste from 100 nuclear power plants that were operating at the time. And everywhere they went to suggest that, well, we might want to look at this region as the site for the nation's high-level nuclear waste repository, they got this reaction. No, we don't want it here. And that was 1982 when they started this search. Now, more than 40 years later, we still do not have a site for this waste. It sits right on the sites of the nation's reactors in pools of water, waiting for a site to be developed. The reason that it hasn't been developed is because of politics, distrust, and poor communication to the public about what this means and what the risks are, and failure to involve the local publics in this type of decision. So we fight about risk issues. Polarized views, controversy, and conflict have become common within risk assessment and risk management. Frustrated scientists and officials in industry and government criticize the public for risk perceptions and behaviors that they judge to be based on irrationality or ignorance. Members of the public feel similarly angry towards industry and government, and this dissatisfaction can be traced in part to a failure to appreciate the complex and socially determined nature of risk. Let's take a look at the word risk and definitions of risk. Risk is tricky because it has multiple definitions. For example, sometimes when we talk about risks, we mean hazards, things that are dangerous. If we say, well, what risks should we rank in terms of high to low? Risks means hazards. Another definition is risk as a probability. If we ask, what's the risk of a birth defect after exposure to a toxic chemical, we're really asking about how likely is that defect. Risk can also be a consequence. What's the risk of letting your parking meter expire? Well, the answer is getting a ticket. That's a consequence. And finally, I think the most justifiable definition is risk as potential adversity or harm. How great is the risk of riding a motorcycle? Well, here risk is some unspecified blend of probability of accident and the severity of the consequence if it takes place. So it involves both probability and consequence. Now, these definitions matter because we have these multiple definitions, it makes communication more complicated and also leads to controversy. So basically, what is risk? I have argued that risk doesn't exist out there independent of our minds and cultures waiting to be measured. Human beings have invented the concept of risk to help them understand and cope with the dangers and uncertainties of life. The dangers are real, but when we measure these dangers by something we call risk, then we're getting into judgment and subjectivity. So there's no such thing as a measurement of a real risk or objective risk. The nuclear engineer's probabilistic risk estimate for a nuclear accident or the toxicologist's quantitative estimate of a carcinogenic risk are both based on theoretical models whose structure is subjective and assumption-laden, and whose inputs are dependent on judgment. One way in which subjectivity enters risk assessment is the dependent on judgments in every stage of the assessment or measurement process, from the initial structuring of the risk problem to deciding what endpoints or consequences to include in the analysis, to identifying and estimating how people are exposed to these hazards, choosing dose-response relationships with chemicals, and so on. There's always a judgment involved. Here's an example. Supposing we want to talk about the mortality risk. Here are two pictures of the risk from coal mining between 1950 and 1970 based on data about the fatalities in coal mining. It's the same data in both pictures, but in the graph on the left is the accidental deaths of miners per million tons of coal mined in the U.S. And you see that clearly there's a decline. By this measure, coal mining is getting safer over time. On the right, we see the same data portrayed as the deaths per thousands of coal mining employees in the U.S. And here you don't see any decline. You know, it's basically flat with some ups and downs depending on whether there were major accidents in a particular year. So it's the same data, but it tells two different stories about whether coal mining is getting safer. This shows how the measures equivalent data portrayed differently can lead to different conclusions. More generally, when you choose a measure of risk, there are a lot of ways of expressing mortality risks. Here's examples from chemical pollution. I'm not going to read all of these, but you see, you can portray the number of deaths that you have as your statistic per million people in the population, people within a certain distance of the exposure, the deaths per unit of the concentration of the chemical, and so forth. All of these are different ways that you can frame the same data. So it's not a simple, obvious way, and when you frame it in different ways, you may come to different conclusions. So every way of summarizing risks, for example, reflects values. For example, if you just count fatalities and you give a number of fatalities, you're actually giving equal weight to deaths from, of young and old people, of deaths that were painful or non-painful, deaths that were due to exposures that were voluntary or involuntary, and also from fair and unfair benefits of exposure. That is, in some cases, the person who died was getting a benefit from doing the risky activities. In other cases, they were not getting any benefit from it. Someone else was benefiting from it. So all of these, if you just count the deaths, you're saying none of this matters. They're all equal. Well, that's a value judgment that you may or may not want to have in your assessment. So the nature of risk is multidimensional. The public has a broad conception of risk, qualitative and complex, that incorporates considerations such as uncertainty, dread, catastrophic potential, controllability, fairness, risk to future generations, and so forth in the risk equation. And these qualities are value-laden. Their values are involved. There are legitimate value-laden issues underlying these multiple dimensions of risk. And these dimensions need to be considered in risk policy decisions. For example, there's the risk from cancer, which is a dread disease worse than risk from auto accidents, which tend not to be dreaded. Is risk imposed on a child more serious than a known risk accepted voluntarily by an adult? Are the deaths of 50 passengers in separate automobile accidents equal to the deaths of 50 passengers in one airplane crash? These are questions that to answer them, it involves how you value different causes of death and different contextual factors. So because of this subjectivity and judgment, I would say that defining risk is an exercise of power, because whoever controls the definition of risk controls the outcome of the decision being considered. If you define risk one way, then one option will rise to the top as the most cost-effective or the safest or the best. If you define risk another way, perhaps incorporating these qualitative characteristics such as involuntary exposure and these other contextual factors that I just mentioned, you'll likely get a different ordering of your recommended decisions because the risk will look differently. So this is why we often fight about how we define risk and why there's a kind of a political element here as well as a scientific element in defining risk for decision making. Now let's talk about how we understand risk perception. So here's some questions to think about. What risks do people in your country worry about most? What important risks do they not worry about? And how do people differ in their perceptions of risk? Some of the risks that people in the United States worry about are terrorism, viruses such as COVID, war, nuclear weapons, proliferation, crime, dangerous medicines, lifestyle risks like smoking or obesity, economic risks, jobs, health insurance, retirement income, and nuclear power and nuclear waste. And when we're talking about risks here, note that we're talking about using the word risk as a hazard. Remember the definitions that I mentioned earlier. Here we're talking about hazards and we're calling them risks. Some risks that people in the United States don't worry enough about are climate change and other threats to nature and environment, natural disasters, earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, except when they happen, then we worry about them for a short period of time. But in general, we underreact to the risks from these natural disasters. Gun violence, war and nuclear weapons, and endangered people facing famine or poverty or in other places genocide, people who are homeless and stateless. These are some of the risks that are less salient, although they should be high in our attention and concern. So risk perception can be quantified, studied, and understood. There are simple ways to measure perceptions. We can ask people to rate a particular hazard, like flying in an airplane, on a scale from 0, no risk, to 100, very great risk. Or we could ask them to rate this hazard on a verbal scale, such as high risk, moderate, slight, or no risk, and then we can kind of average these ratings over people. So when we do this, we find that risk perceptions are driven by concerns that are often not considered in technical risk analysis. So in an early study, we asked people to rate the risk to society as a whole on a 0 to 100 scale. We had up to 90 items, and they included motor vehicles and pesticides and medicines and so forth. And when we did this, we also asked a group of experts to do the same judgment tasks. And then we averaged those 0 to 100 ratings across people, and then we rank ordered the hazards from high to low for the public or layperson sample. And for this group at this time, nuclear power was seen as the most risky activity, followed by motor vehicles, handguns, smoking, and they had 30 of these hazards altogether, and the lowest of the 30 at that time was vaccinations. That likely has changed over the years, but you see at the time vaccinations were not at all a concern. The experts had a very different ordering. They had nuclear power 20th out of 30 on their list, so very different from the public. And interesting, another radiation hazard, X-rays, which was low on the public's concern, number 22, that was higher for the experts. That was number 7. So you see two activities that expose people to radiation had had very different risk perceptions for experts and lay people, and in opposite directions. Things like motor vehicles and guns were similarly rated by both, and smoking were similarly rated by both experts and laypersons. So we also asked people to rate not only the risk and the benefit of these activities, but we also asked them to rate each of these activities on what we call qualitative concerns. Things like whether the degree to which exposure to the risk was voluntary or involuntary, the degree to which the outcomes, if something went wrong, could be catastrophic or just more smaller or chronic non-catastrophic outcomes. We asked whether they had a feeling of dread when they thought about this activity. This turned out to be very important judgment. We asked whether this, if something went wrong, it could be fatal or not, whether the risk was known to the people who were exposed or not known, whether the consequences were immediate or delayed, whether the risk was known to science or not, whether they felt that the risk was controllable by science or by government, whether it was a new or an old or familiar risk activity, and whether the risks and benefits of the activity were fairly or not fairly distributed among those who were exposed. And when we did this, we found that every hazard has a unique profile of qualities, and this helps explain why in some cases a hazard is judged as very high in risk or low. And we see, for example, I was showing you before the fact that nuclear power and X-rays were judged as very different in risk by the public and the experts. And for the public, you see that nuclear power was judged to be much more involuntary than X-rays, more catastrophic, more dreaded, more likely to be fatal. And then down at the bottom, less controllable and newer and less familiar. I think this helps understand in part why nuclear power and X-rays were judged as different in risk, because they were also different in these qualities of risk that were important to people. And you can lay out all these judgments in a spatial figure. There's two dimensions here. On the horizontal dimension is pretty much that quality of being dreaded or not dreaded on the left. And then at the top, you have risks that are judged as not well known or understood, and at the bottom, the well-known risks. So you see that for example, nuclear reactor accidents in the far upper right were judged as dreaded and not well known, and you have things like bicycle and fireworks and chainsaws down in the lower left, which are judged as, not at all dreaded and familiar, and you see other risks in this space. The more you go from left to right, the more people feel that the risk is high and needs to be reduced. In fact, here are the findings from these types of studies summarized. What leads the risk to be greater and accepted more. And by the way, these reactions, this is public reactions, and you can't, there's a tendency to, when the public differs from experts, to say that the reason is that the public is ignorant and irrational. Well, sure, the public doesn't have the same knowledge that the expert does, but the public is reacting to these qualities, and you can't say they're ignorant or irrational when they are concerned about these factors, because these factors reflect legitimate values. So for example, the risk is perceived as greater and acceptance of risk is reduced if the hazard is new and unfamiliar, if exposure is involuntary, if the risk is perceived as not under one's control, if it evokes feelings of dread, if the outcomes are catastrophic, if the benefits of the activity are not highly visible or are not fairly distributed among those who bear the risks. It's also perceived risk is greater and acceptance reduced if risk is posed by human failure as opposed to natural causes. We're much more concerned about humans causing a problem than nature, although nature, as we know, can be very dangerous. If risk is greater, perceived risk is greater, acceptance is reduced if the potential harms are genetic or delayed in time, if the risk is perceived as not well known to science or to those who might be harmed, and if the officials in charge of managing risks are not trusted. So all of these things make sense and need to be considered in decision making about risks. So whether you think the risk perception is wise or foolish, these perceptions have impacts that are quite significant. And this is caused by something that I'll talk about called the social amplification of risk, and which is linked to what we call ripple effects and stigma, and the fact that when something goes wrong, it's not what we interpret from an event is not just how many people are hurt or injured, how much property was damaged, but an accident can signal something about how well the risk is being managed. And we call it signal value, and this drives the impacts. And these risk perception impacts can be predicted and measured and factored into decision making. So let's look first at this concept of the social amplification of risk, which involves the fact that even small losses of life or small property damage can lead to really massive social and economic impacts due to things like stigma effects and the social amplification. And it looks, I'll show you in a minute what that looks like. So there, as I've mentioned, risk events are signals, the perceived seriousness of a mishap, the media coverage it gets, the long-range costs to the responsible company, industry, or agency are determined by the mishap's signal value. Signal value reflects the perception that the event provides new information about the likelihood of similar or more destructive future mishaps. So some high signal events going back in time to the 3 Mile Island nuclear power accident in the United States, or the Bhopal chemical accident in India, Chernobyl nuclear power accident in Ukraine, in the US, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, and Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power disaster recently in Japan. These all had tremendous long-term impacts. After one of the early nuclear power reactor accidents, someone expressed an interpretation of this, which I think illustrates well what signal means. This person says, what truly grips us in these accounts of disaster is not so much the numbers as the specter of suddenly vanishing competence, that's the signal, of men utterly routed by technology, of fail-safe systems failing, and the specter haunts us because it seems to carry allegorical import like the whispery omen of a hovering future, rather flowery language at the end there, but you see the messages that are kind of reading between the lines of the story about what happened and the immediate damage are, what's the meaning of it? And that maybe that we're not as smart or competent as we should have been in managing this hazard. That's the signal. And here's what it looks like in social amplification. Some event takes place. There's an accident in a chemical plant. And this accident has characteristics. It involves, involuntary exposure or dread risk and so forth. And it gets covered by the media. That's the next step. And then people interpret it and look for signals. And often this leads to the loss of trust in the people who were responsible. They didn't do their jobs. There are images, photographs and other images that carry affect. Affect is jargon for emotion. And all of this then leads to the impacts, which are characterized here as expanding circles, starting with the direct harm in the middle. Who are the victims? How many victims are there? How much property was damaged? All of that is kind of what was typically looked at in risk assessment or risk management is the direct impacts. But what social amplification says is there's an impact on the company that was responsible for managing the risk, or maybe the industry. or maybe other technologies if this is a technological accident. And if a company is involved, it's their process that led to an accident, like a chemical plant. Then some of the impacts at that level, the ripple effects are, tougher regulation on the company and on the industry, lawsuits, litigation, and something we call stigma, which leads to a loss of sales of the product made by that company, or community opposition to having that company located near them, problems with investors, withdrawing their investments from the company. All of these are just some examples of the impact at the company level. So the main point is that the impacts are far beyond the inner circle. I'll give you some examples. A while ago, Tylenol, 1982, obviously, someone opened a batch of Tylenol. At the time, you could open these capsules and adulterate them with poisonous chemicals. I think it was cyanide in this case, and there were 7 deaths here, which is serious, but it's a small number of deaths, as compared to things that happen. But nevertheless, this article describes how these 7 deaths and this poisoning of Tylenol led to $1.4 billion for Tylenol and for other companies that were producing these kind of painkillers. These are the ripple effects. So a product crisis like this, we know now, is very predictable from certain factors. If the risk is seen as uncontrollable, as it was with Tylenol, there's no way to protect yourself except not to use Tylenol. And by that, by uncontrollable, it includes that science poorly understands the problems. There's widespread involuntary exposure. The contamination is not observable to the consumers. The effects are latent, delayed in time, and the officials in charge are distrusted. That's a bad sign and leads to this kind of effect on the product and the company. A second major factor is if the risk is dreaded, if the consequences are fatal and horrific, if the contamination is long-lasting, with no easy foreseen end to it, if the consequences will happen later in the future. It's like if you're contaminated or you're exposed to some chemical that causes cancer, it's like having a time bomb within you. If the risk is judged as increasing and unbounded, all of these lead to this feeling of dread. And finally, if the risk is abnormal, it's not supposed to be there in the product, and the victims are otherwise healthy and they're harmed. And finally, there are available substitutes. If one or more of these factors are at work when something goes wrong, it leads to large ripple effects and a crisis for the product. Here's some more examples. A while back, British beef was associated with a brain-wasting disease in cattle. They thought they saw some evidence in humans similar to what was happening in cattle, called mad cow disease. It turned out to be a mistake, but you see what happened. The British beef was stigmatized as being associated with mad cow disease, and the product was banned worldwide. Obviously disastrous for the industry. That's what we call stigma. And here's an example of a stigmatized image, piece of beef designed to look like a skull and crossbones. This creates stigma and big ripple effects. Other economic ripple effects were shown in an experiment that my colleagues and I did, having to do with the impacts of a terrorist-induced dirty bomb scenario in the Los Angeles downtown, and it's linked to the social amplification. So we created a mock hypothetical news story that this dirty bomb rocks the financial district of Los Angeles. And so a dirty bomb is when, say, a radiation therapy device that has radioactive material in it is exploded with a conventional explosion, and it contaminates an area, rather small area, but with radiation. So this was the scenario. And then we measured different types of economic impacts that has to do with the way people would behave with regard to this area and products in this area after this accident. And basically what the analysis shows, this is a rather complex slide, but if you look over at the left, there were enormous losses from ripple effects that had nothing to do with the direct impacts. So if you look at the damage, caused by the explosion, the property damage, or the fact that business was interrupted for a short period, those are direct impacts. But then the behavioral impacts are when people avoid the area. They stop going to work in the area. They stop doing other recreational or other activities in this region. And this analysis showed that the behavioral impacts over 10 years were estimated at 15.8 billion, which is far greater than the direct casualties and property damage estimates, which were only $27 million. So you see that the indirect ripple effects were far greater than the direct damages. There's an important implication for decision making, and that is if you're trying to think about how much money you should spend to reduce a risk from happening, don't just look at the direct damages. You have to take into account the ripple effects, and that may indicate that you should put more money into protecting against this hazard than you ordinarily would if you were only considering the direct damages. So it has an important implication for the decisions about how much money to invest in protecting against a certain type of accident. Another lesson that we've learned from risk perception research is that people's ideologies and worldviews strongly influence their perception and acceptance of risk. So what are worldviews? These are an aspect of cultural elements that are linked to the values that we have with regard to risk and decision making. So in 1982, anthropologist Mary Douglas and political scientist Aaron Wildavsky created a taxonomy of different types of views that people had about what kind of society they preferred to live in, and they called these cultural groups, and these different groups attend to some risks and ignore others to maintain a particular way of life that is important to them. So one of these worldviews that we call hierarchist. It's a vertical orientation in society where some people are at the top of the hierarchy and others at the bottom, and there's a lot of inequality. And basically, this view supports a social relations that are superior versus subordinate, and hierarchists tend to detest civil disobedience because they don't want their if they're high up on this ladder of success, they don't want to lose that position, and so they like to keep things calm and retain their being well off. Opposite of hierarchists are, well, not opposite, but let me start that over. Opposite of a hierarchist This is wrong. Sorry. Okay. So let me skip down to the third group here, because that's the opposite of the hierarchists. It's people who we call egalitarians. These are people who support a broad distribution of power and wealth in society and dislike a differentiation of roles from top to bottom. They want wealth and power to be distributed as broadly in society as possible. So they're opposite of hierarchist views. There's another pair of worldviews that are opposite. One of them is individualism. And individualists support self-regulation and individual achievement and reward, and they don't like social rules that constrain individual initiative. They say, you know, leave me alone to pursue my goals and ambitions as long as what I do is legal. Don't hinder me with a lot of regulation. The opposite type of view is a communitarian view that values the needs or common good of society over the needs and rights of individuals. So these are the types of worldviews that Douglas and Wildavsky identified, and you can measure these views with questions. So here's just some examples of questions that reflect different views. So for individualism, it's, you know, do you agree or disagree that the government should stop telling people how to live their lives? And the third row is the opposite, the egalitarian worldview. Our society would be better off if the distribution of wealth was more equal. Going to the second row, communitarian worldview, is that the government should do more to advance society's goals, even if that limits the freedom of individuals. And at the bottom, we have a hierarchist views. We should let the experts make all the risk decisions for society. Do you agree or disagree? So depending on how you answer this, you get a score on the worldviews. And here's an example of how the worldviews influence judgments about risk. So people answered these questions, and then we look at their score on the egalitarian worldview, and you see on the x-axis, quartile 1 is really people who are very low in egalitarian worldview, and then at the far right are people who are high in this worldview. And then they were asked a question about nuclear power. If your community was faced with a potential shortage for electricity, do you strongly agree to strongly disagree that a new nuclear power plant should be built to supply that electricity? And so as people more and more ascribe to an egalitarian worldview, going from quartile 1 to quartile 4, they less approved of the nuclear power plant. So the hierarchists, non-egalitarians tend to like nuclear power. Egalitarians dislike it. You see how the worldviews influence how we look at risks. Here's another example with a recent technology called nanotechnology. This involves things that are done with very tiny particles, and there are all kinds of different products and technologies can be developed using nanotechnology. It's viewed as a very important new type of technology. And people were asked to what extent do they approve of this technology. And first, they were not given any information about nanotechnology. And you see that in the different colors represent people who were scored by this questionnaire as being individualists, hierarchists, egalitarians, or communitarians. And so without much information, there's not too much difference in the views. And then both groups, all these groups were given information about the benefits of nanotechnology and the risks of nanotechnology, as well as a definition of it. And you see that when they had this information, even though they all got the same information, it split them apart. After reading about the risks and benefits, individualists and hierarchists tend to focus, So the information that was given split the people apart rather than bringing them together. Individualists and hierarchists when they saw the information, focused on the benefits and became more favorable towards nanotechnology. Egalitarians and communitarians, reading the same information, focused more on the risks and became less favorable towards the technology, nanotechnology. So you see that the same information was interpreted differently by people according to their ideology or worldview. So as people, just to repeat, as people learn more about nanotechnology, their reactions depend heavily on their values. When exposed to balanced and accurate information, people who hold largely individualistic and hierarchical cultural outlooks tend to see nanotechnology as more beneficial than risky. People who hold largely communitarian and egalitarian outlooks tend to see nanotechnology as more risky than beneficial when exposed to the same information. The same polarization occurs between people who, in political terms, describe themselves as conservatives and those who describe themselves as liberals. They'll take the same information and interpret it in opposite ways with regard to risk. So this has some implications for research and communication. It points to the need for additional research on techniques for effectively communicating information about nanotechnology or any other technology or risky activity, because people with different values are predisposed to draw different conclusions from the same information. You can't assume that simply supplying information will allow people to reach a consensus on risk from nanotechnology or any other important hazard, much less a consensus that promotes their common welfare. To enable informed public deliberation, it's essential to develop strategies for communicating scientifically sound information that makes it possible for people of diverse views to draw the same conclusions from it. This is not an easy order. It's an open issue for research. How do we provide information in a way that helps people, that brings people together rather than splits them apart? So another lesson from risk perception research that is important is that trust is critical to risk perception, and it's also fragile. Just a little picture showing the importance of trusting the other element in the picture here. Risk and trust go hand in hand. And a pioneer in the nuclear power industry named Chauncey Starr pointed out that the acceptance of any risk, such as risk from nuclear power, is more dependent on public confidence in risk management than on quantitative estimates of risk. So, if you have trust, the path to communicating is smooth. It's easy to communicate if you're trusted. If you don't have trust, if you're not trusted, no form of phrasing or presentation that you make is likely to be successful. And trust is a fragile element. As Abraham Lincoln once said, if you once forfeit the confidence of your fellow citizens, you can never regain their respect and esteem. Well, maybe that's a little extreme. We've seen in recent years in the United States that some people have forfeited the confidence, but they still manage to be listened to. But in general, this is a very valid point that trust is fragile, and it's also what we call asymmetric. And by that I mean it's far easier to destroy trust than to create it. And this is because negative or events such as accidents or lies are more sharply defined. You can point to them more easily than positive things that happen with regard to risk. They tend to be fuzzy or indistinct. So for example, how many positive events are represented by the safe operation of a nuclear power plant for one day? It's not, we're not counting these things. It's running smoothly. It's not a very distinct thing. Now, if that plant has an accident, that is a sharply defined negative event. So you see the difference there in in the sharp versus fuzzy aspect of experience of these things. So and also when a positive or negative event are pointed out, the negative or trust-destroying event far outweighs the positive event in terms of having an impact on your attitudes and your behaviors. And I'll show you what I mean by that. An experiment was done to demonstrate this asymmetry of trust. So we created a large number of events that you might read about with regard to a nuclear power plant that was located in your region. And these are like headlines in your local paper that are good headlines, like there have been no reported safety problems at the plant during the past year, or there's a careful selection and training of employees at the plant, that plant managers live nearby the plant, and that the county medical examiner reports that the health of people living near the plant is better than average for the region. These all should increase your trust in how well the plant is being managed. Now, in this experiment, we also created trust decreasing events that you might read about the local plant. You might read about these as headlines in your newspaper. So, for example, a potential safety problem was found to have been covered up by plant officials, or the plant safety inspections are delayed in order to meet the electricity production quota for the month. A nuclear power plant in another state has a serious accident, or the county medical examiner reports that the health of people living near the plant is worse than the average for the region. So we put these positive and trust increasing and trust decreasing events into a questionnaire, and we asked people to go through this, and for each event to rate whether or not it would increase or decrease your trust in the management of the plant. So here's an example. The headline is, "Government inspections are conducted regularly at the plant." And then you answer, would this increase or decrease my trust in the management? And then people were asked, how much would it increase or decrease your trust, from very small, a 1 or a 2, to a very powerful impact, a 6 or a 7. So this was done for each of many items. And then we averaged these items over all the people who were making these ratings. And I'll show you in the next slide what these averages look like, and you'll see this asymmetry very dramatically. Well, this is just more items of the like. And here's what the data show. So at the top are all the headlines that are good headlines, things that are good at the plant. And you see, and what's being shown here by the bars is the percentage of people who rated each of these headlines as having a 6 or a 7, a very powerful impact on trust in the management of the plant. And you see that there aren't very many powerful, strong trust-increasing impacts. At the bottom are the events that might decrease your trust, or that did decrease one's trust. And you see that the bars are much bigger, a lot of powerful impacts on the decreasing size. Here's what it looks like in terms of some actual items, data items. So it's the percentage of people who rated the impact as very small or very large, and the first one is a negative item. The medical examiner reports that the health of people living near the plant is worse than average for the region. And you see on the right as number 6 or 7, 26 and 24, 50% of the raters rated that as something that would have a powerful impact on reducing their trust in the management of the plant. Now you just change one word from worse to better in the second item. The medical examiner reports that the health of people living near the plant is better than the average, and you see that the 6s and 7s drop to 16% and 2%. A far smaller number who rate the impact as powerful, particularly as number 7 drops from 24% to 2%. Same thing with regard to two other items that are very similar. The plant is found to lack an adequate emergency response plan. So you see that 19 and 35%, 54% of the people rated this as having a powerful trust decreasing impact on their perceptions. Now supposing the plant, you see that there is an emergency response evacuation plan for the people living near the plant. This is good. This is a good thing. And you see only 8 and 10% see this as a powerful impact. This shows the way that bad news has a much more powerful effect on destroying trust than good news has on creating it. So in the United States, for example, the way we deal with these risks tends to amplify the loss of trust. So we have a powerful news media that emphasizes bad or trust-destroying news. We have special interest groups which focus on the bad news they want us to hear for their own messages that they want to have an effect on us. We have an adversarial risk management system with a lot of litigation in the courts which pit experts testifying against other experts and criticizing each other and reducing trust. And we have a large number of risk assessment studies which sometimes disagree and where the science, if the science is limited, shows problems in the assessment. And these studies can increase perceived risk. So this is a culture that we have to recognize that leads to distrust in society. And we have to think about how we might deal with that. Finally, cultural differences in trust are also important. We did a study comparing France versus the United States because they have very different attitudes towards nuclear power. Nuclear power has been a very successful technology in France and not a very successful technology in the United States. And we thought, well, maybe this is because the people in France perceive nuclear power as safe, as low risk, and people in the United States perceive it as high risk. So we asked questions about risk perception in France and the US, along with a lot of other questions, including questions about trust and so forth. And what we found, if you look at where the red arrow is, this is a graph of the difference between France and the US in the percentage of people who judged each of these various elements that are risk elements as high risk. And so you see almost the smallest difference is in nuclear power plants. So the difference in the reaction to nuclear power in the two countries is not about risk. Well, what is it about? Well, we've got some other items that show issues of trust in experts, for example. So you see the United States is in blue and France is in red. And you see the question is, do you agree or disagree that decisions about health risks should be left to the experts? And what we're looking at here is the percentage of people who agree. So a much greater agreement that we should leave health risks to experts in France than the US. Another question, I have very little control over risks to my health. People in France say they don't have control, but obviously that's okay with them because they'll leave it to the experts, let the experts have the control. The US, people in the US feel that they don't have control and they don't trust the experts. And finally, a question about directly about trust in experts. We can trust the experts and engineers who build, operate, and regulate nuclear power much higher in France than in the US. So we see elements of trust in experts and issues of control as underlying why nuclear power has been far more successful in France than in the United States. So let me conclude this lecture by just giving a quick summary of these items that I've talked about that demonstrate the complexity and importance of risk and risk perception. So we talked about what is risk. There are many definitions of risk, and definition of risk can change decisions. Perceived risk can be measured and studied scientifically. Psychometric studies of risk perception have led to an appreciation of the complexity of risk and the importance of values and trust. We've seen that risk is subjective, value-laden, and inherently controversial. That defining risk is an exercise of power in politics. That risk perceptions, whether they're wise or foolish, have immense consequences for health and safety and economic costs and benefits. So thank you for following me on this lecture, and I hope that the information that I've provided will help you think about and manage risk better in your life and in the life of your community and your society. Thank you very much. Here are a few references that you might want to check to learn more about what I've talked about. And again, thank you very much.